Thanks for joining us, so many folks. Oh, it's great to see so many folks here this morning. We're really pleased to have you here. My name is Eliza Canty-Jones, and I work at the Oregon Historical Society. We're really pleased to be partnered with the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education to bring this program to you today. We want to let folks know there are PDUs available for the session today. So please email us about receiving those. You can email Sarah Hanel. That information should be in your registration email that you got from Zoom. If you have any trouble with that, just contact me or Amanda and we'll get you sorted out. I want to let folks know that this morning's program is supported by the Oregon State Parks and Recreation Department through the Oregon Heritage Commission. So thanks to everyone who is continuing to pay those state park fees and do whatever lottery dollars you're spending. Your Oregon State Parks money supports very good things. And we're really pleased that the Heritage Commission agreed to support this program that we're working on in partnership to bring you good educational support. My organization, the Oregon Historical Society, our mission is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. We are really working to do as much as we possibly can to support educators now more than ever and make sure that we have digital online opportunities for learning and supporting your teaching, whether it be in the classroom or from a distance, or some uncertain mix of the two for the next however long it's going to be. We have amazing resources and we want to make sure that we're helping you get to those in whatever way you can. We have an educator email list. You can go to ohs.org, scroll to the bottom and sign up to receive those special educator emails. And you can also sign up to just follow the regular OHS emails, which sometimes include that information. So stay tuned for more information about professional development opportunities around History Day, around using our curriculum for Nevertheless They Persisted, which is a history of voting rights, civil rights, and protest in the United States, and also for professional development opportunities for curriculum from our Experience Oregon exhibit. We understand you and your students are not likely to be able to come visit the exhibit this year, so we want to make sure we get as much of that content to you and are as helpful as we can be in getting you the material that you need to teach good Oregon history and fulfill all of the many ethnic studies and other requirements that the state has put in place. So again, my name's Eliza Canty-Jones. Feel free to reach out to me if there's anything you need from us or questions that you have about the work we're doing to support educators. And just know that we are in awe of the amazing work you do, and we are cheering you on and here to support you in whatever way we can. So please keep in touch. We're coming to you today, Amanda and I, as your co-hosts from this program, are coming to you today from Portland, Oregon. Portland is located on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Wallala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. And both of our organizations acknowledge the ancestors of this place and understand that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. So we really recognize these communities and honor their legacy and their lives and their descendants, and encourage everyone to do the same. Obviously, you're all here because you're interested in Indigenous history. So this is not a group I have to encourage to spend time learning about Indigenous history in the United States, but we're really pleased you've chosen to do so. The way the program is going to go, I'm going to turn it over shortly to Professor Ostler, who's going to present about his work from the book Surviving Genocide. And then we're going to break from the presentation. Amanda's going to speak just a little bit about the Holocaust and Genocide studies requirements that the state has and the essential questions that can be used to guide that learning in your digital or in-person classrooms. And then we're going to split you all into groups so that you can talk a little bit about how you might apply this work to that work in the classroom. And then we'll all come back together as one big group so you'll have the opportunity to share with each other and also to ask any further questions of Professor Ostler. So that's the basic. Please feel free to use the Zoom group chat to communicate with each other or to communicate with any of us during the presentation or the breakout rooms. And I think that's the big thing. I am so excited about this presentation this morning. I had an opportunity to read the book earlier this year, and it really is just an amazing piece of scholarship that is unbelievably detailed and specific, and also at the same time really advances a substantial and important narrative for all of us in trying to understand the history of the United States, the history of Indigenous nations here in this place, the relationships between the two of them, and how we think about genocide and national policy and survivance and resilience. So we asked him to pack all of that into a 30-minute or so presentation for you all today. But again, I do recommend the book. Jeffrey Ostler is Beekman Professor of Northwest and Pacific History at the University of Oregon. He's the author of The Lakotas and the Black Hills and The Plains Sioux and U.S. Colonialism from Lewis and Clark to Wounded Knee. And I should say that the Surviving Genocide, the United States and Native Nations from the American Revolution to Bleeding Kansas is the first of a 2-volume series. So when that second volume is finished, it will address much more of the history in our region, and will make him come back again. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Ostler. Yay.
Well, thank you very much, Eliza, and thank you all very much for being here this morning. I want to begin with just a few initial observations and then dive in. One of the first things I want to say is that in thinking about genocide and Indigenous peoples in the Americas, we have a very long and complicated history. Of course, we're dealing with 500 years or more of history. We're dealing with hundreds of Native nations. We know that there are over 500 federally recognized tribal nations within the US boundaries now. And we also know that there are many hundreds of other Indigenous nations throughout the Americas. So we're going to have a situation of many different experiences and histories. And the process of European colonialism was not the same in all times and places during this history. The process of European colonialism had different timing. The process unfolded unevenly. And sometimes the process was genocidal, sometimes intensely so, sometimes less intensely. But there's periods in this history where we probably aren't seeing genocidal process. We're seeing other things going on. So it's a long and complicated history. Now, my focus today is going to be on one piece of this much larger history. It's focusing on the United States and Indigenous people from 1776 to the Civil War. This is what I cover in my book. And the first slide here shows the cover of the book. And I wanted to just point out the watercolor that I was able to get permission to use. It's a watercolor by a Choctaw artist named Valjean Hessing of the Choctaw removal, which occurred in the 1830s. And it really demonstrates the theme of the book. These are people who I think are surviving genocide. And then on the next slide is a map. Do you have, yeah. This shows the geography of the book and some of the tribal nations. It's really the eastern part of what becomes the United States and a little bit west of the Mississippi into the areas that become Kansas, Oklahoma, and so on. And that's the area that becomes important because that's the area where the US policy of Indian removal, it moves people from the east into that area, into what's now we would think of more as the Midwest. Now, when we think about the United States and Indigenous people, we have to think about the United States as a settler colonial society or a settler colonial empire. And so I want to say just a little something about settler colonialism as a concept. It's a concept that developed as a way to contrast with ordinary colonialism. So if you think of, say, the British in South Asia or something like that, the purpose of British colonialism there wasn't so much to eliminate Native people there. It was really to exploit their labor. So that is the sort of general logic of regular colonialism. But under settler colonialism in the United States, being a settler colonial society, the idea is to settle the lands of indigenous people and eliminate them, to remove them from those lands. What settler colonists want is land. They don't want labor. So that's settler colonialism. But then the question is, how will settler colonialism be achieved? How will indigenous people be eliminated? There's many conceivable ways to do that, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. It's also important, I think, to recognize the survival and resilience of Native nations. So there's a danger, I think, in discussions of genocide that it may risk, if that's all we're talking about, it may risk reinforcing the common misperception that Native people have just simply disappeared. If it was all genocide, then maybe it was an entirely successful project and there are no more Native people today. And of course, that's wrong. And we have to always emphasize that despite being subject to genocidal processes, we do have over 500 federally recognized tribal nations and other unrecognized tribal communities within the borders of the United States. So with those few initial thoughts, let me now dive into really what I cover in my book. And there's kind of two phases. One phase is US policy toward Native Americans from 1776 to 1830. That's a key date. And then from 1830 up until the eve of the Civil War. So diving into that first phase, 76 to 1830. Now the United States is going to want to eliminate Native people, take those lands. The United States doesn't say, oh, the way that we're going to do this is through killing all Native people. They don't say, let's send out armies and try to kill as many people as we possibly can. Instead, what the United States says is that what we would like to happen, and this is a kind of what I call Plan A, our Plan A is that what we'd like is for Native nations to willingly agree to give up their lands and ultimately move west in exchange for assistance toward becoming, quote, civilized. And so we would like Native people to willingly sign treaties doing that. Well, that's Plan A, but it actually doesn't work that way. And what happens, in fact, is that Native people do not want to give up their lands. And so they believe that they have full ownership of their lands, that they have every right to stay where they are. And that's in contrast to what the United States thinks. The United States thinks that Native nations have a right only to occupy their lands until, quote, civilized people want to use them. And that notion of a right of occupancy only, by the way, is based on the discovery doctrine, which is in, many of you have it, the Essential Understandings of Native Americans in Oregon discusses the discovery doctrine. So Native people resist giving up their lands. The United States then threatens them with dire consequences and says, you must sign these treaties. Otherwise, there will be terrible consequences. And under duress, some leaders of some communities do sign, but others don't. And what happens is that process leads to widespread perceptions among Native people that the treaties, although they're officially signed, the United States regards them as legitimate, that Native leaders regard them as illegitimate. And that then means that many Native leaders organize multinational movements of resistance. And the best known, there are many of these during this period, the best known of these multinational movements of resistance is one in the early 1800s that's led by two Shawnees. And Eliza, if you could go to the next slide. two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. And they organized really throughout the eastern United States to try to stop this process of using treaties, in their view, illegitimately to eliminate people. So once we have a movement of resistance, then the United States turns to what I call Plan B. And that, I think, is structured into policy. And Plan B is genocidal warfare. So this is really where genocide comes in my view. What the United States does is it declares that resistance is illegitimate. It demonizes resistors as, in the language of the Declaration of Independence, as merciless Indian savages. And the United States says that resisting Native people must be exterminated or extirpated. Now, of course, as all of you know, the term genocide had not been invented yet, but the terms extermination and extirpation were in common currency, and I believe that those are quite clearly synonyms for genocide, and genocide in the strong sense of involving physical killing. And so during this period, the United States sends armies to destroy communities, and these armies aren't necessarily always successful in achieving that intention. And in some cases, actually, Native fighters are able to ambush US armies and inflict significant casualties. But sometimes United States armies are able to achieve their intention to inflict catastrophic, indeed genocidal violence. And a good example of this would be in 1814, Andrew Jackson led an army against poorly armed Creek Red Sticks who were affiliated with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's movement. And Andrew Jackson attacked them at a place called Horseshoe Bend in Alabama in 1814 and took the lives of 800 fighters and also some non-combatants. Horseshoe Bend is often referred to as a battle. But I think that in fact, and it's true that some of the Red Stick fighters were armed, but rather poorly, but it had the characteristics of a battle for a little while, but it was quite clear after some small period of time that Jackson was just simply slaughtering unarmed people and some people trying to flee across a river and being shot down. And I think that many, at least some of those were non-combatants. So it is often called a battle, but I think that it took on clearly the shape of a genocidal massacre. So that's how genocide can actually occur during this period as part of what I'm calling Plan B. Now, let me turn then to a second phase that I cover in my book. And this now is the period from 1830 to 1860. Now, all along, US leaders have been talking about ultimately removing Eastern Native nations west of the Mississippi, relocating them there as a way of achieving elimination. Example would be Thomas Jefferson in 1803, when he acquired Louisiana from France in the Louisiana Purchase. One of the rationales he gave was that the areas in the Louisiana Purchase would be a good place to remove Eastern nations. You could stick them, he said, in this new area, the Louisiana Purchase. So that possibility was on the table early on, but it wasn't really feasible until the late 1820s to really imagine that the United States had the capacity to really force all these different people into the West. And so in 1830, the United States passes the Indian Removal Act, which then makes it the official US policy to achieve removal or expulsion of Eastern Native nations. The rationale that the government put forward for removal was the Native people in the East who were in proximity to white people, that Native people were vanishing and that they would soon disappear. This was the language that was used, and so that they needed to be moved west for their own good. And this, I would say, was a racist argument that Native people were inherently inferior to whites or Anglo-Saxons, and that living in close proximity to them, they just, because of their inferiority, just simply couldn't survive. So they needed to be moved west for their own good. That was the rationale. So it was put forward as a supposedly benevolent policy. Now, the United States imagined, and this is again a kind of plan A, the United States imagined that Native leaders could be convinced that in fact it would be for their own good to move west. And so the United States sends commissions to talk to the leaders of the Eastern nations and says, you know, for your own good, please do this. And you are kind of children, and we are your parents or your great father, and we know best what is good for you. And the idea was that Native leaders would just realize this and do it willingly. But in fact, what happens is that Native leaders don't want to move, just like before. They don't want to sign removal treaties. And so then we see the same logic as before, that the United States uses various means of coercion to force them to move, and threatens to exterminate them if they don't. Now, under that kind of pressure, if you're being threatened with extermination, and you know from previous experience what US armies can do, most leaders of Native nations actually comply. And so they don't want to, but they do feel that they are forced to sign treaties, or at least minorities of nations are forced to do this and move west. But some Native nations don't. And so an example of a resisting Native nation is the Sacs and Meskwakis. And if you could go then to the next slide, Eliza, under the leadership of Black Hawk, who's the figure here on the left of the slide, the United States was in this period, the early 1830s, wanted to force the Sacs and Meskwakis from their villages really on the east bank of the Mississippi. They were an agricultural people, also a hunting people, but to force them to vacate those villages and move west, at first into Iowa, but ultimately into Kansas. And so this map shows US troops and state militia forces pursuing Black Hawk's people who refused to move up in through northern Illinois, up into southern Wisconsin, and then west across the Mississippi River. And what Black Hawk's people are trying to do is simply avoid getting massacred. And so they are fleeing US troops. And in August of 1832, they try to cross the Mississippi River, but they're intercepted and US troops slaughter them. And here again, we see a genocidal massacre against people who are resisting. And so the next slide depicts the Bad Axe Massacre. In addition to infantry troops who are firing at unarmed people and people just trying to flee from the shore, the United States, as it's depicted here, has an armed steamship called the Warrior on the Mississippi firing onto makeshift rafts. And so you can see this massacre in which about 250 people are killed. So again, this is how we see genocide actually occurring during this period. And there's other instances of extreme violence used in the removal period. Now, we also need to talk about the consequences of removal. The usual focus when people talk about removal from the east to the west, the usual focus is on the Cherokee Trail of Tears and sometimes the other southeastern nations, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Creeks. But the policy also applied to the north. A typical map on the next slide, this is a map from actually a very good textbook that I use in my own teaching that shows it, Indian removal. And you can see the removals are being depicted from the southeast and also the Sauk and Meskwaki removal. But completely absent here, and it's quite typical, are any removals from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, or Michigan, or for that matter, New York. There are some from New York. And so this is a big hole in our understanding of this period. And in my book, I talked about the southeastern removals, but I also want to talk about the northern removals. And so on the next slide is a map from the book that shows the removal routes of several of the nations from Indiana and Eastern Ohio, Ottawas, Shawnees, Senecas, Wyandottes, and Miamis. And the next slide shows some additional removals from this same geography, Potawatomis, Kickapoos, Ho-Chunks, and Ojibways. So I just wanted to show those maps to highlight the fact that removal, it's not just trying to get rid of southern nations in order to make room for plantation slavery, it's also trying to get rid of northern nations to make room for capitalist economic development and free labor, farming, and other activities. So the journeys themselves, these many, many trails of tears were deadly. People were moved under terrible conditions, there's starvation, there was disease, and I tried to document those things that occurred. But I also wanted to document the fact that the misery didn't stop at the end of the Trail of Tears. So when people are forced from their homeland and they're forced into new lands, they are in miserable conditions in those new lands for a long time. Rebuilding nations is very difficult. People in the West are subject to malnutrition. They've been traumatized through this violent process of uprooting. They're suffering from social stress, and they're suffering from many diseases. So the demographic consequences of removal, taking into account not only the journeys, but also what happens after, are truly catastrophic, and I don't think fully appreciated. So let me just give you one example. It returns to Black Hawk's people, the Sauks and Meskwakis, and I have a slide, the next slide, showing the Sauk and Meskwaki population. So in 1830, before the Black Hawk War, you can see that the population of the Sauk and Meskwaki Nation is about 6,500. And then after the Black Hawk War, they've lost 500 people. That's a lot. That's a big percentage, almost 10% through the Black Hawk War. But then the Sauks and Meskwakis are moved to Iowa, and then they're moved to Kansas and relocated there a couple of times. And the consequences of those removals are just devastating, as you can see in those numbers. And by the time of 1870, their final removal out of Kansas into Oklahoma, right after the Civil War, they're down to 900 people. So that leads us then to a question about whether the US policy of Indian removal was in fact a genocidal policy. And there are two issues, I think, in thinking about that question. One is the consequences of the policy, and the other is the intent. So first, on the consequences, I think that the consequences of the policy, it's pretty clear, are genocidal. I mean, if you look at those numbers of the Sacs-Meskwakis, to me, it's pretty hard to avoid a conclusion that we're seeing genocidal consequences. And the Sacs-Meskwaki situation represents an extreme, but there's other nations that suffer population losses close to that. And there are many others that suffer massive population losses, not quite as severe, but still staggering. So I think the consequences are clearly genocidal. But the second issue that we have to consider is a question of intent. Intent is always important in discussing genocides. And the stated intent of the policy, as I explained earlier, was benevolent. It was to save people. So, you know, maybe it wasn't really a genocidal policy if the intent was not to be genocidal. Now, on this point, I would say, in the first place, when I look at the statements of US policymakers, presidents, et cetera, in 1830, when they're justifying the new policy of Indian removal, when I look at their statements, it's frankly hard for me to believe that they were actually serious. It seems, you know, that they are making up an ideological justification for something that they want to do, which is they want to eliminate people, but they want to make it seem that they're not doing a bad thing. So it's hard for me to believe that they were serious in the first place. But let us give them the benefit of the doubt about their initial intention. But then we have to watch their response to what happens when their policy is implemented. Because the policy wasn't just implemented in 1 year. It didn't happen just all at once. It was implemented over several years. It lasted throughout the 1830s. It lasted into the 1840s, and in some cases, removals were still occurring in the 1850s from the east to the west. And so we have to watch their response to an unfolding catastrophe. And their response was to not care about what was happening. They didn't say, oh, it looks like our policy turns out actually to be terribly destructive despite what we thought. And because we are benevolent, we're therefore going to stop the policy. They don't do that. They continue with the policy knowing that it has catastrophic consequences. And in my view, to continue with a policy that has genocidal consequences is the same as intending to commit genocide. So that takes us kind of through some of the things that I cover in my book. Now for the rest of my time, what I want to do is pull back just a bit and make just a couple of broader observations that I think my research reveals. One of the broader observations that I'd like to make is about the issue of the relationship between disease and genocide. One of the common responses, and many of you would be familiar with this response, I'm sure, one of the common responses to allegations that the United States or other polities committed genocide against Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere is to say, no, it wasn't genocide because all or most of the Indians died from disease. It was just a sort of unfortunate accident, but you can't really blame Europeans because, you know, they brought disease. It's sad, but it isn't intentional. And so we can't really talk about genocide. So that's one common response. And it's a response that draws on what's known as the virgin soil epidemic theory. That was a theory that was put forward many decades ago. And it holds that Indigenous populations fell catastrophically by as much as 70% or more pretty much everywhere in the Western Hemisphere at the moment of initial contact. And the reason, of course, was, according to the theory, was that Europeans brought diseases, particularly smallpox and measles, that indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere had no immunity to, and so they were completely wiped out or nearly wiped out upon initial exposure to these diseases called, as I say, virgin soil diseases. Now, scholars are really pointing out some real problems with this thesis. They're showing that, for one thing, virgin soil epidemics were rather rare, actually, that many Native people didn't suffer right away from exposure. Their first contacts with Europeans weren't necessarily from Europeans who had these diseases. And that, moreover, if they had healthy immune systems, they were to some extent able to fight off some of these diseases, even though they may not have had exposure to those specific ones. But we're also much more cognizant now of the relationship to disease as an ongoing issue in Native communities long after initial contact, and disease in relationship to ongoing and intensifying processes of European colonialism. So the example then, that I've been talking about earlier in what happens to Native people through removal is quite germane here. The removed nations that were subject to the catastrophic population declines that I've showed you, they had already been exposed to smallpox earlier and other diseases. It's not like they didn't have immunity to smallpox. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Sauk and Meskwaki population declined was that there was a smallpox epidemic, but it was only one of many, many different diseases that affected the Sauks and Meskwakis and other nations subjected to the similar history. There was cholera, there was dysentery, there was malaria, there was typhus, and there was alcoholism, which I treat in the book as a disease. And these were diseases that were hitting people year after year after year. And it really has nothing to do with virgin soil epidemics. It has everything to do with colonial policies. The second issue I want to take up and conclude with is really to go back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of emphasizing survival and resilience. And so here, let me just relate a story that I briefly tell in the book. It's a story about how a man named Hiram Thorpe, an Irish American, was in Kansas in the early 1850s. And he was on the Sauk and Meskwaki reservation when this terrible population loss was occurring. And Hiram Thorpe was, one of the things he did was to make cheap coffins for Sauks and Meskwakis who were dying. He was a blacksmith that was making coffins. And during that period, Hiram Thorpe married a Sauk woman, a woman named Wind Woman, and they had children. And then one of their grandsons was Hiram Thorpe, or excuse me, Jim Thorpe, who in the slide is being shown a photograph where Hiram Thorpe in 1912, of course, went to the Stockholm Olympics, won 2 gold medals, and in the slide is being shown next to New York dignitaries at the end of the ticker tape parade to welcome him back and to celebrate him as the greatest athlete in the world. So somehow or another, people did survive what was happening in Kansas in the 1850s. And here is Hiram Thorpe, who I think of as a survivor of genocide. We can also, I think about resistance and its legacies in productive ways. So, you know, I was talking earlier about the resistance movement that was organized by Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. They were trying to keep their lands. And, you know, to some extent, significant extent, that movement actually didn't succeed. They weren't able to avoid substantial dispossession. But I think it would be a mistake to see that kind of resistance that we can see going on in history as somehow just a failure. Because I think that that spirit of resistance and the legacy of that resistance, that example of that kind of resistance, but also many other kinds of resistance, continues to animate and to inspire Native people today in different kinds of resistance. So in 2016, when I was observing what was going on at Standing Rock with the No DAPL movement and the water protectors, I saw there the spirit of resistance that I've seen in thinking about Indigenous history, spirit of resistance of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, the spirit of resistance of many other Native nations' histories. And when I saw just recently on July 3rd, Native people protesting Donald Trump's visit to Mount Rushmore, and saying, you know, this is stolen land. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that these lands were taken unlawfully and that these lands should be returned to their rightful owner, the Lakota Nation. I saw there too resilience and the drawing upon of these earlier histories and traditions of resistance. And so I think in our teaching that that's something as well that we can talk about, is to draw connections between previous movements of resistance of all sorts and talk about that in terms of the current political movements and struggles of Indigenous nations now. So that's the end of what I have to say. I look forward to our later discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. So Amanda, I think you'll talk to us now a little bit about what to do in the breakout rooms, yeah?
Yep. Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda. I'm the manager of Museum and Holocaust Education at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. It's so nice to see all of you here this morning. I thank you so much for coming. And so just a little bit about OJM and then the mandate, which is now in effect. So the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education explores sorry, my stutter gets really bad sometimes. The legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teaches the lessons of the Holocaust, and provides opportunities for intercultural conversations. OJM-CHE challenges our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. So just to give you a little bit about the Holocaust and Genocide mandate, which is officially in effect. It was passed unanimously last year. And so it is a K-12 mandate. There's no specific grade levels. Instead, there are content concepts. So what that means is that there are A through G, there are certain content concepts that can be discussed in different grade levels. And we hope that it kind of becomes secular and that they come back throughout various grade levels. So what we've done at the museum is we have worked with Amit Kobrowski and our teacher advisory board to come up with some essential questions to guide you into addressing these content concepts. So what I'll be doing in a minute or so is sharing the link to a select amount of the essential questions for you to discuss in your breakout group, so you have something to talk about with other teachers. I've also included at the bottom of that Google page some strategies for remote learning. So I've met with teachers from our teacher advisory board over the summer to discuss ways that, how do you take all of this new information and how do you get students to interact with it or show that they understand it? So in there's ways to have a live debate over Zoom. There's also ways to have an asynchronous debate over Zoom. But we have a list of about 15 different ways to engage students remotely. So in your breakout rooms, we're going to be asking you to look over some of the essential questions, talk about how am I going to take this new information and put it into my classroom, either in person or virtually. And before we kind of let you go and do that, I do want to remind you that we have some really great professional developments upcoming next week on August 19th. Amit Kobrowski, many of you know, the social sciences instructor at ODE, will be in conversation with the author of A More Beautiful and Terrible History. We also have an anti-bias training through the ADL on the 18th. And then later on, we're going to be having a really great professional development about the use of diaries, specifically from youth during the Holocaust with Alexandra Zapruder. So if you're interested in getting emails from us, you can always sign up with us, and we hope to see you there.
Thanks, Amanda. You know, I'll say also, please use me and Amanda as resources. We may know people who can be those kinds of virtual speakers. Part of my job is editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, which is published by OHS, and we're always happy to make those resources available to teachers and your students, of course. So don't ever hesitate to ask. And if there's somebody who you think, oh, I want somebody to be able to speak about X project to my students or to answer questions from my students about Y piece of history, just ask us. If we don't know and we don't have an answer, then no problem. But oftentimes we will know someone to connect you with. So please don't hesitate to ask. And also, I think we have information from folks, but reach out to us if you haven't already about getting that PDU credit. We really appreciate folks taking the time to be here this morning and engage in some of these big ideas. And thank you, thank you, thank you. You're the heroes of our community, and we love you. And let us know what we can do to help you. All
Thank
right?
you.
Yes,
All
thank
right.
you so much. This
And
was
thank you, Jeff,
wonderful.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Take care, everyone.